I'm Vanessa McLean, 44, a Bronze Star veteran who learned to build a life by showing up when it counted. For years, I covered for my brother, quiet loans, excuses, keeping the peace. Then, at our Father's Will reading, he stood up and called me a fake soldier, and I made a different choice. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you cared for? Share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into it, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to draw a hard line to protect yourself, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. It sounded like freedom. Patricia called me 3 days later with what she delicately termed a proposition from your brother. He wants to contest the will? I asked. No. He wants to make a deal. I was in Dad's garden, pulling weeds from the flower bed Mom had planted 20 years ago. The physical work felt good after days of phone calls and legal discussions. My hands were dirty, my back ached, and for the first time since the courthouse scene, my mind felt clear. What kind of deal? He's proposing to split the estate 50-50. House, investments, personal property, everything except the business interests your father specifically designated for him. In exchange, he withdraws any public claims about your military service, and we all move forward quietly. I sat back on my heels, studying the roses Mom had babied through decades of harsh winters. Some of them were struggling now, without her careful attention, but others had grown wild and strong. He thinks I'll give him half the inheritance to make this go away? That appears to be his assumption. The audacity was breathtaking. Charles had publicly humiliated me, questioned my service record, and attempted to steal my inheritance based on lies he'd spent years constructing. Now he wanted to be rewarded for his failure with half of what the court had legally awarded to me. What's his timeline on this generous offer? He'd like an answer by Friday. He's apparently concerned about the media attention. Of course he was. The story had been picked up by several military blogs and veteran advocacy sites. Local man challenges sister's military service, loses inheritance, wasn't exactly the headline Charles had been hoping for when he decided to make the will reading a public event. Tell him no. Vanessa, I have to advise you that family will contests can be expensive and emotionally draining, even when you're likely to win. Sometimes a negotiated settlement serves everyone's interests better. Patricia, I've been negotiating with Charles my entire life. I've been settling for less than I deserved, accepting partial payment for full service, compromising my own interests to keep peace in the family. That ends now. She was quiet for a moment. All right. I'll convey a response. And Patricia? If he wants to contest the will officially, tell him he's welcome to try. But he should know that the classified documentation the court reviewed was only a summary. The complete file is much more comprehensive. After I hung up, I continued working in the garden, thinking about the years of compromises that had brought us to this point. Every time I'd settled for partial payment, every time I'd accepted Charles's version of events to avoid conflict, every time I'd chosen peace over justice, I'd been teaching him that my boundaries were negotiable. The lesson had taken so well that he'd assumed even federal court decisions were subject to his revision. My phone buzzed with messages from relatives as word of Charles's generous offer spread through the family network. Uncle Jim thought I should consider it for the sake of family harmony. Aunt Linda believed splitting things evenly was only fair. Cousin Beth reminded me that money wasn't worth destroying relationships over. None of them mentioned that Charles had chosen to destroy our relationship when he'd stood up in court and called me a fake soldier. None of them acknowledged that his generous offer was actually an attempt to profit from his own cruelty. The family pressure intensified over the following days. Charles had clearly orchestrated a campaign, mobilizing relatives to contact me with variations of this same message. Be reasonable, think about family, don't let money come between siblings. Each conversation followed the same script, suggesting Charles had briefed them on which arguments might be most effective. Your parents would be heartbroken to see you two fighting like this, Cousin Beth told me during what she described as a casual check-in call. My parents would be heartbroken to know Charles called me a fake soldier in public court, I replied. Well, yes, But you know how Charles gets when he's emotional. He didn't really mean it. But he had meant it. That was the point everyone seemed determined to miss. Charles hadn't made an offhand comment or lost his temper in the heat of the moment. He'd planned this attack, prepared his accusations, and chosen the most public possible venue to deliver them. The cruelty had been calculated and deliberate. "I think you should take the deal," my friend Jessica told me over lunch. "Not because you owe him anything, but because this whole situation is eating you alive." She wasn't wrong. I'd been sleeping poorly, snapping at colleagues, unable to concentrate on simple tasks. The stress of maintaining my position against the entire family's pressure was exhausting. "He humiliated me in front of everyone we know," I said. "He questioned my service record based on lies he'd been spreading for years. And now I'm supposed to reward him for it. You're supposed to take care of yourself. And holding on to anger isn't taking care of yourself." But it wasn't anger I was holding on to. It was boundaries. For the first time in my adult life, I was refusing to compromise my own interests to make other people comfortable. The discomfort everyone was feeling wasn't my responsibility to fix. Friday came and went without a response from me to Charles's offer. Patricia called that evening to report that Charles was disappointed but not surprised by my silence. "He's asked me to convey that this was his final attempt at an amicable resolution," she said. "Good. I'm tired of his attempts at amicable resolution. Vanessa, he's hired his own attorney. A fellow named Davidson who specializes in estate litigation. They're planning to file a formal contest next week." I felt a strange sense of relief. The waiting was over. Charles had chosen his path, and now we could both live with the consequences. What are we looking at in terms of timeline and cost? Months, potentially years. Tens of thousands in legal fees minimum. And it will all be public record, which means more media attention. That works both ways. If Charles wants to make this a public fight about my military service, we can make it a very public defense, complete with documentation he'd prefer to keep private. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "What kind of documentation?" "Financial records showing the $27,000 I've sent him over the years. Email correspondence about his various business failures. Bank records showing the debts I helped him consolidate. If he wants to argue that I don't deserve this inheritance because I'm somehow fraudulent, we can discuss who in this family has been living fraudulently." That's comprehensive. "I document everything, Patricia. It's a military habit." The lawsuit was filed the following Tuesday. Charles alleged undue influence, claiming I'd manipulated our elderly father into changing his will by exaggerating my military service. He requested the estate be divided equally between us, with provisions for reimbursing his legal costs. The local paper picked up the story, framing it as a dispute between siblings over their father's legacy. The military blogs were less diplomatic, treating Charles's allegations as an attack on veteran credibility generally. Several advocacy organizations offered to file amicus briefs supporting my position. "This is getting bigger than a family dispute," Patricia warned me. "Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" I was cleaning out Dad's study when she called, sorting through decades of business correspondence and personal papers. In one drawer, I'd found a letter he'd written to the Department of Veterans Affairs supporting my application for a service-connected disability rating. His words about my dedication and sacrifice were more eloquent than anything I could have said in my own defense. "I've been under scrutiny my entire military career," I told Patricia. "The difference is that now the scrutiny is based on facts instead of Charles's fantasies. He's claiming emotional distress from the media coverage. His attorney is suggesting you're using your military status to generate sympathy and public support." I laughed, but it wasn't entirely pleasant. Charles made this a public spectacle when he invited half the county to watch him humiliate me in court. He doesn't get to complain about media attention now. The irony was perfect. Charles had spent years undermining my credibility privately, then chosen to attack it publicly, apparently assuming that no one would investigate his claims seriously. Now that his accusations were being scrutinized by people who actually understood military service and documentation, he wanted to retreat back to private family negotiations. But it was too late for that. He'd opened a door he couldn't close, started a fight he couldn't control. The publicity he'd courted was now working against him, and the family pressure that had once supported his position was beginning to fracture as more relatives learned the actual details of his accusations. Uncle Jim called me that evening, his voice careful and formal. "Vanessa, I owe you an apology." I didn't understand what Charles had actually said in court until I read the transcript his attorney filed. "Thank you. For what it's worth, your father was incredibly proud of your service. He showed me your commendations every time I visited. He never had any doubts about your integrity." Other relatives followed with similar calls over the next few days. Not all of them, and not with full apologies, but enough to make it clear that Charles's support network was eroding. The public documentation of his accusations was forcing people to take sides based on facts rather than family loyalty, and the facts weren't flattering to his position. "He's making mistakes," Patricia reported after a meeting with Davidson, Charles's attorney. "Getting emotional in depositions, contradicting his own timeline, making claims he can't support with evidence. Davidson's good, but he's working with bad material." "What kind of mistakes?" "He claimed you'd never been in combat zones, then had to admit he didn't actually know where you'd been stationed. He alleged that your commendations were routine administrative awards, then couldn't explain the classified briefing requirements mentioned in your personnel file. He's essentially arguing from ignorance, and it shows." I wasn't surprised. Charles had always been careless with details when he was angry, assuming his confidence would carry him through situations his preparation couldn't handle. It had worked in family contexts where people wanted to believe him. It was failing spectacularly in legal contexts where evidence mattered more than charm. The case stretched through the fall and into winter, generating periodic headlines as new motions were filed and dismissed. Charles's position became increasingly desperate as his original allegations were systematically dismantled by documentation he'd never seen and couldn't challenge. "Davidson wants to discuss settlement," Patricia told me in December. "Charles is willing to withdraw the contest and accept the will as written." "In exchange for what?" "Nothing. He just wants out." I was decorating the Christmas tree in what was now legally my living room, hanging ornaments Mom had collected over 40 years of marriage. Each one held memories of holidays when Charles and I had been allies rather than adversaries, when family had meant protection rather than betrayal. "Tell Davidson we'll accept Charles's withdrawal of the contest," I said. "But I want a formal apology. Public, on the record, acknowledging that his allegations about my service were false and harmful." "Vanessa, he's not going to agree to that. Then he can continue with the lawsuit. His choice." It took Charles 3 weeks to make his decision. The apology, when it came, was grudging and minimal, but it was public and legally binding. He withdrew his contest of the will, acknowledged that his allegations had been based on incomplete information, and expressed regret for any damage to my reputation. It wasn't enough, but it was something. More importantly, it was over. The inheritance was secure, my service record was vindicated, and Charles's credibility was permanently damaged by his own choices. I spent New Year's Eve alone in the house, not from loneliness, but from choice. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't managing anyone else's crisis or cleaning up anyone else's mistakes. I was simply living my own life on my own terms, with boundaries that were mine to set and maintain. The silence was profound and peaceful. It sounded like justice. Charles tried to rebuild our relationship that spring. It started with a card for my birthday, the first he'd remembered to send in 5 years. The message was carefully neutral. "Hope you have a wonderful day. Looking forward to better times ahead." I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. The lawsuit had revealed the depth of his resentment and the calculated nature of his campaign against me. Those weren't the kinds of feelings that disappeared with a legal settlement. They were the kinds of feelings that waited for better opportunities. 3 weeks later, he called directly. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message while making coffee in the kitchen where we'd once been allies. "Vanessa, I know things got out of hand with the legal stuff. I was grieving Dad, making bad decisions, listening to the wrong people. But we're family. We've always worked things out before." The wrong people was interesting. It suggested Charles was constructing a narrative where he'd been led astray by bad advisors rather than making deliberate choices based on years of accumulated resentment. It was classic Charles, accepting partial responsibility while deflecting the core issue onto external factors. I deleted the message without calling back. 2 more calls followed over the next month, each message slightly more desperate than the last. He'd driven by the house and noticed I was renovating the kitchen. He'd heard from Aunt Linda that I was doing well. He missed talking to me about family stuff. What he really missed, I realized, was having someone to clean up his messes. The lawsuit had cost him significant money in legal fees, money he'd apparently borrowed against expectations of winning the case. His business ventures continued to fail at regular intervals, but now he had to handle the fallout independently. He's having financial difficulties, Patricia mentioned during one of our quarterly meetings about estate administration. Davidson mentioned it during our final settlement conference. That's not my problem anymore. I know. I just thought you should be aware in case he escalates his contact attempts. She was right to warn me. Charles's next approach was more direct. He showed up at the house on a Saturday morning while I was working in Mom's garden, letting himself through the side gate like he still belonged there. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. I didn't look up from the tomato plants I was staking. "No, we don't. Vanessa, this is ridiculous. We're adults. We can have a conversation about what happened. What happened is that you called me a fake soldier in front of our entire family to steal my inheritance. Then you spent 6 months in court trying to prove I was a fraud. We don't need to talk about that. It's documented." He sat down uninvited on Mom's old garden bench, the one Dad had built for her 40th birthday. "I was wrong about some things, okay? I admit that. But you have to understand the position I was in." "What position was that?" "You'd been gone for years. Deployed constantly, never around for family events. Dad got this idea that you were some kind of war hero, and suddenly everything revolved around your service record. I felt invisible in my own family. There it was. The real grievance. Not that I'd exaggerated my service, but that my service had overshadowed his civilian accomplishments. Not that I'd manipulated Dad, but that Dad had been proud of me in ways that made Charles feel diminished. So you decided to destroy my reputation to make yourself feel better." I decided to bring some balance to the conversation. Dad was making decisions based on incomplete information. I finally looked up at him. He was thinner than I remembered, stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before the lawsuit. The legal battle had cost him more than money. "Charles, you called me a fake soldier. In public. In front of a judge. You alleged that I'd built my entire adult identity on lies. There's no balance in that. There's no misunderstanding to clear up. You tried to destroy me, and when that failed, you want to pretend it was all a miscommunication. I want to rebuild our relationship. Our relationship was built on me protecting you from the consequences of your choices. I'm not doing that anymore." He was quiet for several minutes, staring at the garden we'd played in as children. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller, more uncertain. "I'm in trouble, Vanessa. Real trouble this time. I know. The business loan I defaulted on, it's more complicated than I thought. There might be criminal charges. I need help." Of course he did. This wasn't about rebuilding our relationship or making amends for his behavior. This was about recruiting me for another rescue mission, another crisis requiring my immediate intervention. What kind of help? Financial, mostly. And maybe character references. People who can vouch for my integrity, explain that I'm not usually the kind of person who calls his sister a fake soldier to steal her inheritance. He flinched. Who gets involved in complex business arrangements he doesn't fully understand. I stood up, brushing dirt from my knees. "Charles, I vouched for your integrity for 20 years. I co-signed loans, sent money, made excuses, covered for mistakes. Then you stood up in court and told everyone I was a fraud. My vouching days are over. So you're just going to abandon me? I'm going to let you handle your own problems. Like an adult. Vanessa, please. I know I screwed up, but I'm drowning here. You're the only family I have left." The manipulation was so familiar it was almost comforting. Charles in crisis, appealing to family loyalty, promising this time would be different if I'd just help him one more time. But the dynamic had changed. I wasn't the person who'd spent 20 years afraid to disappoint him anymore. You had family, Charles. You chose to sacrifice that relationship for money you weren't entitled to. Now you want the relationship back to solve problems the money was supposed to fix. That's not how it works. I walked toward the house, leaving him sitting on Mom's bench in the garden where we'd once been children together. At the back door, I turned around. Charles, you spent years convincing our family that I was dishonest, that my service was exaggerated, that I couldn't be trusted with important decisions. You were very effective. So effective that now, when you need someone to vouch for your character, you can't understand why the person whose character you destroyed doesn't want to help you. I never said you couldn't be trusted with important decisions. You said I couldn't be trusted with Dad's inheritance. In court. Under oath. With reporters present. He had nothing to say to that. I went inside and locked the door, leaving Charles alone with the consequences of his choices for the first time in his adult life. He called twice more that week, both calls going directly to voicemail. I didn't listen to the messages. Whatever crisis he was facing, whatever help he needed, whatever promises he was making about changed behavior and rebuilt trust, none of it was my responsibility anymore. That felt strange at first. The absence of crisis management left a void in my schedule that I wasn't sure how to fill. But gradually, the space filled itself with other things. Volunteer work with veteran organizations. Renovations to the house that reflected my preferences rather than family compromises. Relationships with people who valued my contributions without questioning my credibility. 6 months later, Patricia called with an update on Charles's legal situation. The criminal charges had been dropped, but he'd declared bankruptcy and lost his remaining business assets. He'd moved in with a cousin upstate, apparently planning to start over in a new location with a different approach. He asked Davidson to convey his appreciation for your discretion during his difficulties, she told me. My discretion? You didn't speak to reporters about his financial problems or personal history. He's grateful for that. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or be insulted. Charles was grateful that I hadn't publicly humiliated him during his legal troubles, after he'd publicly humiliated me during mine. The fact that he thought my restraint was noteworthy said everything about how he would have behaved in my position. Did Davidson say anything else? Charles wanted you to know that he's learned from his mistakes and hopes someday you can find a way to forgive him. Tell Davidson that forgiveness isn't the issue. Trust is. And trust, once broken the way Charles broke it, doesn't get rebuilt with apologies and good intentions. It gets rebuilt with years of consistent behavior that demonstrates actual change. Should I expect him to contact you directly about that? No. Charles doesn't have years of patience for rebuilding anything. He wants immediate solutions to immediate problems. When he realizes that repairing our relationship would require sustained effort over a long period with no guaranteed outcome, he'll find something easier to pursue. I was right. Charles never contacted me about rebuilding trust or demonstrating change. He sent one final card at Christmas, a generic season's greetings with no personal message, then disappeared from my life as completely as I'd disappeared from his. The extended family eventually stopped asking when we were going to reconcile, stopped suggesting that holidays weren't the same without both McLean's siblings present, stopped treating our estrangement as a temporary misunderstanding that time would heal. Instead, they began treating me as an individual rather than half of a sibling set, someone whose opinions and decisions stood independently rather than in relationship to Charles's parallel choices. It was a subtle shift, but profound. I was finally being seen as myself rather than as Charles's sister. The inheritance that had started this entire conflict became the foundation for the life I built afterward. Not just the financial security, though that mattered, but the validation. Dad had seen who I really was, had recognized the sacrifices I'd made and the integrity I'd maintained, had trusted me with the family's future in ways he'd never trusted Charles. That recognition, legally documented and judicially confirmed, gave me permission to see myself clearly too. Not as the protective older sister whose worth was measured by her willingness to sacrifice for family harmony, but as someone whose service and character merited protection in their own right. Justice, I discovered, wasn't loud or dramatic or satisfying in the ways I'd expected. It was quiet and methodical and complete. 2 words from a judge, and everything changed. Not through punishment or revenge, but through truth finally being allowed to speak for itself. That was enough. That was everything. 5 years passed before I saw Charles again. 5 years of building a life that belonged entirely to me, without the constant weight of his crises or the exhausting work of managing his reputation alongside my own. I'd renovated the house completely, turning it from a museum of our parents' marriage into something that reflected my own preferences and priorities. The military precision that had once seemed out of place in our family home now felt natural and appropriate. I'd also started a nonprofit organization, using part of the inheritance to fund educational scholarships for children of deployed military personnel. The work was deeply satisfying, connecting me with families who understood the sacrifices that came with service in ways my own family never had. These were people who respected military commitment without needing constant explanation or defense. The organization had grown beyond my initial expectations, attracting national attention and significant donations from veteran advocacy groups. We'd funded 47 scholarships in 3 years, helping kids whose parents were overseas maintain their educational goals despite the financial and emotional challenges of military family life. It was at the annual scholarship dinner that I saw him. Charles, standing near the registration table, wearing a suit I didn't recognize and talking to Patricia Chen with animation that looked forced even from across the room. My first instinct was to leave, to avoid whatever confrontation he'd planned for this venue. But this was my event, my organization, my work. I wasn't going to be driven away from something I'd built. I approached slowly, giving myself time to assess the situation. Charles looked better than he had during our last encounter in Mom's garden. The stress lines around his eyes had softened, and he'd gained back some of the weight he'd lost during the legal battle. Success agreed with him, apparently, though I couldn't imagine what success he might have achieved. "Vanessa," he said when he noticed me approaching. "You look wonderful. This is quite an impressive event." His tone was careful, respectful in a way that felt unfamiliar. No trace of the dismissive humor that had characterized most of our adult conversations. No subtle undermining or backhanded compliments. Just straightforward acknowledgement, as if he were speaking to someone he respected rather than someone he could manipulate. "Thank you. What brings you here, Charles?" "I wanted to make a donation to the scholarship fund. And I was hoping we could talk, if you have a few minutes." Patricia appeared at my elbow, her expression professionally neutral, but her body language protective. "Vanessa, the keynote speaker needs to do a sound check in 10 minutes. "This will be quick," Charles said. "I promise." I studied his face, looking for signs of the calculation that had driven our previous interactions. But he seemed genuinely nervous, almost vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen since we were children. "All right. 10 minutes. We found a quiet corner of the hotel lobby, away from the dinner preparations and scholarship recipients. Charles sat across from me in a leather chair that dwarfed him slightly, making him look younger than his 42 years. "I've been following your work with the organization," he began. "It's remarkable what you've accomplished." "Thank you. I mean that sincerely. When I read about the scholarship program, about the families you're helping, I realized I'd never really understood what military service meant. Not just for the people serving, but for everyone around them. I waited for the qualification, but that would reveal his true agenda. It didn't come. "I've been in therapy," he continued, the words coming out in a rush like he was afraid he'd lose courage if he slowed down. "For 3 years now. Working through some things about our family, about how I treated you, about why I felt so threatened by your success." Threatened. That's what Dr. Martinez calls it. Threatened by your confidence, your integrity, your ability to make sacrifices for something bigger than yourself. She says I spent years trying to diminish you because acknowledging your achievements would have forced me to confront my own failures. The honesty was startling. In 20 years of adult relationship, Charles had never admitted to any emotion more complex than frustration or any motivation less noble than family loyalty. This level of self-awareness felt like listening to a stranger. "What kind of failures?" "All of them." He laughed, but it wasn't his old dismissive laugh. This one was rueful, self-deprecating in a way that seemed genuine. The business ventures that were really just ways to avoid real work. The debts I ran up expecting other people to cover them. The relationships I sabotaged because I was afraid of being seen clearly. He paused, staring at his hands folded in his lap. The way I treated you. That was the biggest failure. You spent your whole life protecting me, supporting me, believing in me when I didn't deserve it. And instead of being grateful, I was resentful. Instead of celebrating your success, I tried to tear it down because it made me feel small. I felt something shifting in my chest, a loosening of tension I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was there. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. This was the conversation we should have had 20 years ago, before the patterns became entrenched, before the damage became irreversible. Why now? I asked. Why are you telling me this now? Because I got arrested again 6 months ago. Another business deal gone bad, another set of charges that could have sent me to prison. But this time, when I looked around for someone to blame, someone to rescue me, someone to fix what I'd broken, there wasn't anyone. He met my eyes directly, something he'd rarely done during our confrontations. I had to handle it myself. All of it. The lawyers, the negotiations, the consequences. And you know what I discovered? I'm actually capable of handling my own problems when I stop looking for someone else to handle them for me. What happened with the charges? Plea agreement. Community service, restitution, probation. No prison time, but I had to make things right with everyone I'd hurt. That included facing what I'd done to our relationship. The dinner crowd was beginning to filter back from the cocktail hour, and I could see Patricia looking for me near the ballroom entrance. My time was almost up, but I found myself reluctant to end this conversation. Not because I was ready to rebuild anything with Charles, but because this version of him was someone I'd never met before. I'm glad you're taking responsibility for your choices, I said. That's important progress. Vanessa, I know I can't undo what I did. I know calling you a fake soldier in court, trying to steal your inheritance, spending years undermining your reputation, those aren't things you get over with an apology and some therapy insights. No, they're not. But I want you to know that I see it clearly now. I see how much I hurt you, how much damage I did to our family, how completely I betrayed everything you'd done for me. And I'm sorry. Not because I want something from you, but because you deserve to hear it. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. This is a check for the scholarship fund. It's not much, but it's everything I can afford right now. I wanted to contribute to something you'd built, something that helps people the way you always helped people. I took the envelope but didn't open it. Charles, I appreciate this, but a donation doesn't change what happened between us. I know. I'm not trying to buy forgiveness or pretend we can go back to being siblings like none of this happened. I just wanted to do something positive in your name instead of something destructive. Patricia appeared beside our table. Vanessa, we really need to start. I stood, still holding the envelope. I have to go. I know. Charles stood too, extending his hand formally. Thank you for listening. And congratulations on all of this. Dad would be incredibly proud. The handshake was brief and professional, like something that might happen between business associates rather than siblings. But it felt honest in a way our relationship had never been, free of the manipulation and resentment that had characterized our interactions for decades. I walked back to the dinner, Charles's envelope in my hand, wondering what to do with this unexpected encounter. The keynote speech went well, the scholarship recipients were inspiring, the donors were generous. But throughout the evening, I found myself thinking about the conversation in the lobby. Later that night, alone in my hotel room, I opened the envelope. The check was for $5,000, made out to the scholarship fund with a memo line that read, "In honor of Vanessa McLean's service." It represented a significant sacrifice for someone rebuilding his life after bankruptcy, more meaningful than larger donations I'd received from people for whom the amount was negligible. But it was the letter folded behind the check that surprised me most. Vanessa, it began, I've written this letter dozens of times over the past 2 years, trying to find words that could adequately express my regret for what I did to you and our family. I've finally realized that no words are adequate, which is why I've focused instead on changing my behavior and taking responsibility for my choices. You asked me once why I felt so threatened by your success, and I gave you the therapy answer about feeling diminished by your confidence. That's true, but it's not complete. The real reason I resented your military service was that it represented everything I wasn't brave enough to be. You chose to serve something larger than yourself. You made sacrifices for principles you believed in. You accepted risks and hardships because you thought they mattered. I chose comfort, convenience, and personal benefit every time I faced similar choices. Your example made my choices look selfish and small, which they were. Instead of learning from your example, I tried to destroy it. Instead of using your inspiration to become a better person, I used my energy to convince everyone that you weren't as good as you appeared. I turned your greatest strength into a weapon against you, and I did it systematically over many years. I want you to know that I understand the full scope of what I did. It wasn't just about the inheritance, though that's where it culminated. It was about undermining your reputation, questioning your integrity, making you doubt yourself, and turning our family against you. It was sustained cruelty disguised as sibling rivalry. You don't owe me forgiveness. You don't owe me a relationship. You don't owe me anything. I'm writing this because you deserve to know that someone sees clearly what you sacrificed for our family and what I cost you in return. I hope your organization continues to grow and help more families. I hope you find peace and satisfaction in the life you've built. And I hope someday you can think about our childhood without the pain I added to it later. Your brother, Charles. I read the letter 3 times, looking for hidden agendas or manipulative language. But it seemed genuinely straightforward, an acknowledgement of harm done without requests for absolution or promises of changed behavior. It was, I realized, the first completely honest communication I'd ever received from Charles. The next morning, I called Patricia to discuss what to do with his donation. It's a legitimate contribution, she said. There's no legal reason you can't accept it. I'm not worried about the legal issues. I'm worried about the emotional ones. What kind of emotional issues? If I accept the donation, does that mean I'm ready to have some kind of relationship with Charles again? If I reject it, am I punishing him for finally taking responsibility for his behavior? I don't know what message either choice sends. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Vanessa, you've spent most of your adult life managing other people's interpretations of your choices. Maybe the message you send matters less than the choice that feels right to you. She was correct, as usual. I'd been so focused on how Charles might interpret my response that I hadn't considered what response would be most authentic to my own values and priorities. I deposited the check and sent a brief acknowledgement note to the address he'd provided. Thank you for your donation to the scholarship fund. Your contribution will help a military family pursue educational opportunities. Best regards, Vanessa. It was professional, appropriate, and final. Not cold, but not warm. Not rejecting his attempt at amends, but not inviting further contact. It felt honest, which was more than our relationship had been in decades. Charles didn't respond to the note, which told me everything I needed to know about whether his apology had been genuine. He'd made his gesture, expressed his regret, and moved on with his life without expecting or demanding reciprocal gestures from me. That restraint, more than anything else, suggested he might actually have learned something from therapy and experience. 6 months later, I heard through Aunt Linda that Charles had moved to Oregon, where he'd found steady work with an environmental consulting firm. Nothing glamorous or entrepreneurial, just reliable employment that allowed him to meet his financial obligations and rebuild his credibility. He was apparently dating someone, a teacher who had no connection to our family drama and no knowledge of our history. He seems different, Aunt Linda told me during one of our quarterly phone calls. Quieter. More thoughtful. Less. She struggled for the right word. Less entitled. I suggested. Yes, exactly. Like he's finally grown up. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions hearing about Charles's apparent transformation. Relief that he was taking responsibility for his life. Sadness that it had taken 42 years and near criminal consequences for him to develop basic adult functioning. Regret that we'd lost so many years to patterns we'd been too stubborn or afraid to challenge earlier. But mostly, I felt gratitude. Gratitude that I'd held my boundaries when the pressure to compromise had been overwhelming. Gratitude that I'd chosen my own integrity over family harmony. Gratitude that I'd learned to value my own judgment more than other people's comfort. The inheritance that had precipitated our final break had become the foundation for work that gave my life deeper meaning than any family relationship ever had. The isolation that had felt so painful during the legal battle had evolved into independence that felt empowering rather than lonely. The reputation that Charles had tried to destroy had been rebuilt stronger and more authentic than it had ever been before. Sometimes justice wasn't about punishment or revenge or even reconciliation. Sometimes justice was simply about truth being allowed to prevail over manipulation, integrity being valued over convenience, and people being held accountable for their choices regardless of family loyalty or social pressure. The two words the judge had whispered in that courthouse 5 years ago had changed everything, but not in the dramatic way I'd expected at the time. The real change had been quieter and more gradual, built through hundreds of small decisions to prioritize my own well-being over other people's expectations. I was 44 years old, living in the house where I'd grown up, running an organization that reflected my deepest values, surrounded by people who respected my contributions without questioning my credibility. It wasn't the life I'd planned when I was young, but it was better than anything I could have imagined back then. And Charles? Charles was learning to build his own life on his own terms, finally accepting responsibility for his choices without expecting anyone else to manage the consequences. It had taken a family crisis and a legal battle and years of therapy to get him there, but he'd arrived at a place where he could be honest about his failures and committed to doing better. We weren't siblings anymore, not in any meaningful sense. Too much damage had been done, too much trust had been broken, too much time had passed. But we were both finally living authentic lives, no longer trapped in patterns of protection and resentment that had served neither of us well. That felt like resolution, if not reconciliation. That felt like justice, even if it wasn't revenge. That felt like the ending our story had always been heading toward, once we were both brave enough to tell the truth about who we'd really been all along. I should have seen it coming at Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago. The way Charles leaned back in Dad's old chair, swirling his wine like he owned the place. Mom had just finished telling everyone about my latest deployment, her voice bright with pride, when he cut in with that laugh. Not cruel exactly, but dismissive. Come on, Mom. Vanessa's playing dress-up with the government. It's not like she's out there fighting real wars. The table went quiet. Uncle Jim shifted in his seat. Aunt Linda studied her plate. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I'd had as a kid when he'd tell his friends I was adopted, just to watch me cry. It's important work, I said quietly. Sure it is. He raised his glass in a mock toast. Here's to my sister, the weekend warrior. Mom tried to smooth it over, changing the subject to his new business venture. Charles had always been good at redirecting attention back to himself. That night, I helped clear dishes while he held court in the living room, regaling Dad with stories about his latest investment opportunities. He doesn't mean it, Mom whispered as we loaded the dishwasher. You know how he gets when he's had a few drinks. But I knew better. Charles had been testing boundaries since we were children, seeing how far he could push before someone pushed back. The difference now was that I wasn't a scared little girl anymore. I was a decorated officer with clearance levels he couldn't imagine, but to him, I'd always be the sister who needed protecting. The pattern continued at Christmas. Small comments about military benefits being cushy government handouts. Jokes about how I probably spent my deployments filing paperwork in air-conditioned trailers. Each dig landed with surgical precision, designed to diminish without seeming overtly hostile. You're being sensitive, he'd say if I called him out. I'm just teasing. But there was nothing playful in the way he questioned my service record in front of our cousins, or how he'd interrupt my stories from overseas with skeptical looks. He was building a case, laying groundwork for something I couldn't quite see yet. The rail warning came at Easter dinner. Dad had been talking about updating his will, mentioning how proud he was of both his children. Charles's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Later, as we cleaned up, he cornered me in the kitchen. You know, Vanessa, Dad's getting older. Sometimes he gets confused about things. What's that supposed to mean? Just that he might not remember everything accurately. About your service, I mean. The stories change each time he tells them. I stared at him. My service record is documented, Charles. It's not a story. Of course. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I just think it's important to be honest about what really happened over there. For everyone's sake. That's when I understood. He wasn't just questioning my credibility for sport anymore. He was positioning himself for something bigger. The inheritance. Dad's estate wasn't enormous, but it was substantial enough to matter. The house, the investments, the family business interests. Charles had always assumed it would flow naturally to him as the son, the businessman, the one who'd stayed close to home. My military service complicated that narrative. It made me look responsible, selfless, worthy. It gave me claim to being the child who'd served something larger than herself while he'd served only his own interests. In his mind, my reputation had to be destroyed for his inheritance to be secure. The attacks became more frequent after that. At Mom's birthday party, he questioned whether I'd actually been in combat zones or just support areas. At Dad's retirement celebration, he wondered aloud if all those medals really meant what people thought they meant. Each comment was carefully calibrated, delivered with just enough humor to maintain plausible deniability. You're paranoid, my friend Jessica told me over coffee. Brothers say stupid things sometimes. But I'd learned to trust my instincts in dangerous situations. The threat assessment was clear. Charles was working systematically to undermine my credibility with the family. He was gathering allies, feeding doubt, creating space for his version of events to take root. The enablers made it worse. Distant relatives who barely knew me started treating me differently, their smiles more forced, their questions more pointed. Had I really been overseas as long as I claimed? Were those commendations as significant as they sounded? Charles's campaign was working. I tried confronting him directly once. What are you trying to accomplish with all this? I don't know what you mean. The comments. The implications. What's your endgame? He looked genuinely confused, which made it worse. Vanessa, I'm not trying to hurt you. I just think our family deserves honesty. Dad's putting you on this pedestal, and I'm not sure it's entirely deserved. Not deserved. Look, I'm not saying you didn't serve. But the hero worship thing, it's gotten out of hand. You were a logistics officer, not Rambo. There it was. In his mind, my service had been inflated beyond recognition by family pride and military propaganda. He genuinely believed I was exaggerating my contributions, trading on unearned valor for personal gain. The worst part was that he seemed to think he was protecting the family from my deception. I stopped trying to defend myself after that. Every protest just fed his narrative that I was defensive because I had something to hide. Instead, I documented everything. Every conversation, every slight, every undermining comment. I built my own case file, knowing that someday, somehow, the truth would matter. Dad passed suddenly that winter. A heart attack in his sleep, peaceful but unexpected. At the funeral, Charles delivered a beautiful eulogy about family loyalty and staying true to your roots. He barely mentioned my service, except to note that I'd managed to come home safely. The message was clear. I'd been away while he'd been present, distant while he'd been devoted. We'll get through this together, he told me at the reception, his hand on my shoulder like we were united in grief. But I saw the calculation in his eyes, the quiet satisfaction of someone whose long game was finally paying off. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. Charles seemed confident, almost cheerful, as we walked into the courthouse together. He'd invited what felt like half the extended family, turning what should have been a private moment into a public event. I realized then that this wasn't just about money. It was about validation. About proving once and for all that his version of our story was the right one. The courthouse felt smaller than I'd expected, cramped with the weight of too many people and too much anticipation. Charles had claimed the front row like he was the star of his own show, surrounded by cousins and family friends who hung on his every word. I sat in the back, alone except for my lawyer, a quiet woman named Patricia Chin who'd handled Dad's estate planning for years. Large turnout, Patricia murmured as we settled into our seats. Charles likes an audience. The judge, an older man with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, entered with the formal ceremony these moments demand. He'd clearly done this hundreds of times, moving through the preliminary statements with practiced efficiency. The will itself was straightforward in its opening sections. Small bequests to various relatives, charitable donations, the usual administrative details that settle a life's final business. Then came the main provisions. To my son Charles, the judge read, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room, I leave the family business interests and associated properties, with the understanding that he will maintain the legacy our family has built. Charles nodded slightly, accepting what he'd always considered his birthright. A few relatives smiled and whispered congratulations. I felt nothing, having expected this outcome. To my daughter Vanessa, the judge continued, I leave the remainder of my estate, including the family home and all personal assets, in recognition of her service to our country and her character. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds. Then Charles was on his feet. Your Honor, I need to object to this provision. The judge looked up surprised. Mr. McLean, this is not a trial. There's no basis for objection during a will reading. There is when the inheritance is based on false premises. Charles's voice carried across the room with the confidence of someone who'd practiced this moment. My sister has misrepresented her military service to our family for years. She's a fake soldier, Your Honor. She gets nothing. The sound that rippled through the room wasn't quite laughter, but it was close. Nervous chuckles from relatives who didn't know whether this was appropriate or scandalous. Uncle Jim coughed uncomfortably. Aunt Linda whispered something to her husband. I felt the familiar burning in my chest, the same helpless anger I'd carried since childhood. But this time was different. This time, Charles had miscalculated. Sir, the judge said firmly, these are serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support this claim? Everyone in this family knows she exaggerated her service record. She was stationed at a desk job, playing up minor assignments to look like a war hero. Our father was elderly and confused when he made these provisions. He didn't understand the reality of her situation. More murmurs now, louder and less charitable. I could feel the family turning, measuring Charles's words against their own doubts. He'd been planting these seeds for years, and now they were blooming in public. This is highly irregular, the judge said. Ms. McLean, would you like to respond to these allegations? I started to stand, but Patricia's hand touched my arm gently. Your Honor, we came prepared for this possibility. My client anticipated that her service record might be questioned. Prepared how? Patricia reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax and official stamps. We have documentation from the Department of Defense regarding Ms. McLean's service record. Given the classified nature of some of her assignments, this information was compiled by military intelligence and sealed for civilian court review. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. Classified assignments. Yes, Your Honor. If you'd review the documentation, I believe it will clarify any questions about my client's military service. Charles laughed, but it sounded forced now. Come on, Your Honor. Classified assignments? This is exactly the kind of fantasy I'm talking about. She probably typed reports for supply officers and turned it into some top-secret spy story. Mr. McLean, the judge said sharply, you will remain silent while I review these documents. Patricia walked forward and handed him the sealed envelope. The breaking of the wax seal seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The judge opened the folder carefully, his expression neutral as he began reading the first page. Then something shifted in his face. The casual confidence of a routine proceeding gave way to focused attention. He turned to the second page, then the third, his reading pace slowing as the content apparently became more complex. Minutes passed. The room grew restless. Charles shifted in his seat, his confidence wavering as the judge's expression grew more serious with each page. I could see him starting to doubt himself, wondering what exactly was in that folder. Finally, the judge looked up. Not at the room generally, but directly at me. His eyes held a respect that hadn't been there before, mixed with something else. Surprise, maybe. Or recognition of something he hadn't expected to encounter in his small-town courthouse. Ms. McLean, he said quietly, would you please stand? I stood, feeling the weight of the room's attention, but also something else. For the first time in years, I felt seen for who I actually was rather than who others assumed me to be. The judge's voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the room, everyone heard the two words that would change everything. Court adjourned. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, confused murmurs, the scrape of chairs as people tried to understand what had just happened. Charles's face had gone white, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "Your Honor," he managed, "what does that mean?" "The reading isn't finished." But the judge was already gathering the documents, resealing them with careful precision. When he looked up again, his expression was formal, final. "The court accepts the will as written and authenticated. Ms. McLean, you'll need to coordinate with the clerk's office regarding the transfer of assets. Mr. McLean, I suggest you speak with your attorney about any further questions." He stood and walked out, leaving behind a room full of confused relatives and one very pale brother. The inheritance was mine. All of it, except for the business interests Dad had specifically designated for Charles. The house, the investments, the personal assets. Everything Charles had assumed would flow to him by right of gender and proximity had just shifted to me in two quiet words. Patricia packed her briefcase with calm efficiency. "We should go," she said softly. "Let them process this privately." As we walked toward the exit, I could hear Charles behind us, his voice rising in pitch and desperation. "This is insane. She can't just walk away with everything. There has to be an appeal process. This has to be illegal somehow." But I didn't turn around. For the first time in my life, I didn't need to defend myself against my brother's accusations. The truth had finally spoken for itself, and it had been loud enough to silence everyone else in the room. We protected him from everything when we were kids. Not just the neighborhood bullies, though there were plenty of those. Charles had always been small for his age, quick with his mouth but slow with his fists, the kind of kid who could talk his way into trouble but never fight his way out. I was 11 when Tommy Brewster cornered Charles behind the school cafeteria. 3 years older and twice as wide, Tommy had been waiting for an excuse to flatten someone, and Charles had apparently given him one with a comment about Tommy's lunch money techniques. I found them just as Tommy was pulling back his fist. "Pick on someone your own size," I yelled, stepping between them. Tommy laughed. "You're smaller than he is." But I bite harder. I didn't actually bite him. But I did kick him in the shins hard enough to make him hop around cursing while Charles and I ran for the safety of the playground monitors. That night at dinner, Charles told Mom and Dad how his brave big sister had saved him from the school bully, making me sound like some kind of superhero. "Vanessa always looks out for her little brother," Dad said, ruffling my hair. "That's what family does." It became our pattern. Charles would get himself into situations, and I would get him out. When he accidentally broke Mom's favorite lamp with his football, I told her I'd done it while dusting. When he forgot about his science project until the night before it was due, I helped him build a volcano that actually worked. When he got caught cheating on his math test in 8th grade, I tutored him every night for months until his grades improved enough that the teacher forgot about the incident. "You don't have to do this," he told me once, but not with much conviction. "Yes, I do. We're family." The protecting continued into high school, though the problems got more complex. Charles was popular in the way that careless, charming people often are, but he had terrible judgment about which parties to attend and which girls to date. I became expert at extracting him from situations before they spiraled completely out of control. When he totaled Dad's car senior year, driving drunk after a party I'd specifically warned him not to attend, I was the one who called the tow truck and got him home before our parents woke up. I paid for the repairs with money I'd saved from my part-time job at the grocery store, and when Dad asked about the damage, I told him I'd scraped against a post in the school parking lot. "I owe you big time," Charles said, but he never paid me back. Not the money, not the favor, not the lie I'd told to protect him. College separated us physically, but not emotionally. He went to state on Dad's dime to study business, while I earned a partial scholarship to a smaller school where I could double major in international relations and Arabic studies. Even from a distance, I found myself managing his crises. Late-night phone calls about failed classes, emergency loans to cover expenses he couldn't explain to our parents, advice about professors and girlfriends, and career choices he never seemed able to make independently. "You should let him solve his own problems," my roommate Vanessa with an H told me. "He's never going to learn if you keep rescuing him." But I couldn't stop. It felt like abandoning him, and abandoning Charles felt like betraying everything our parents had taught me about loyalty and responsibility. Besides, I was good at fixing things. It gave me purpose, made me feel needed in a family where Charles was the charming one and I was the serious one. The military changed everything, though I didn't realize it immediately. Basic training stripped away all the comfortable assumptions I'd carried about what I could and couldn't do. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who didn't know me as Charles's protective older sister. I was just Vanessa McLean, and I had to prove myself on my own merits. I thrived in ways that surprised everyone, including myself. The structure, the mission focus, the clear expectations, all of it clicked with something deep in my personality that civilian life had never quite accessed. When I called home after graduation, I felt different. Stronger. More independent. "You sound like a soldier," Charles said during one of our conversations. "I am a soldier." "I mean, you sound harder. Less like my sister." But I was still his sister. When he dropped out of business school Charles' year to pursue what he called entrepreneurial opportunities, I wired him $2,000 from my military pay to help cover his expenses while he figured things out. When his first business venture failed spectacularly, leaving him with debt and no clear prospects, I co-signed a loan he needed to get back on his feet. "This is temporary," he promised. "I just need to catch a break." The breaks never came, but the requests for help continued. Each deployment brought new emergencies requiring immediate financial assistance. His rent, his car payment, his credit card bills, his investment losses. I sent money regularly, considering it my contribution to family stability while I was overseas and unable to help in other ways. Dad never asked where Charles was getting the money to maintain his lifestyle, despite his inconsistent employment. I think he preferred not to know. It was easier to believe his son was finally becoming responsible than to acknowledge that his daughter was subsidizing his independence from halfway around the world. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Charles lived comfortably in the family home, dating casually and pursuing business schemes that never quite materialized, I was sleeping in barracks and eating MREs and dodging mortars in places whose names I couldn't mention in letters home. But somehow, in our family's mythology, I was the one who'd taken the easy path. Military benefits are so generous these days, Aunt Linda mentioned during one of my rare visits home. All that free housing and healthcare. It's like permanent vacation. I didn't bother correcting her. What would be the point? The family had constructed a narrative where my service was comfortable and Charles's civilian struggles were noble. My job was to maintain that narrative, not challenge it. So I smiled and nodded and sent another check when Charles called about his latest crisis. The resentment built slowly, so gradually that I didn't recognize it until it was too big to ignore. It started during my third deployment, when Charles called to complain about Dad pushing him to find more stable employment. "He doesn't understand that I'm building something bigger than just a regular job," Charles said. "I'm trying to create generational wealth for our family." Generational wealth built with my military salary, I thought, but didn't say. "Maybe you could talk to him," he continued. "He listens to you." That's when I understood. I wasn't just protecting Charles anymore. I was enabling him. Every crisis I resolved, every check I sent, every excuse I made, it all allowed him to avoid the consequences of his choices while taking credit for the successes I'd made possible. But I kept protecting him anyway, because that's what family did. Because abandoning him felt like admitting failure. Because changing the pattern would require confronting truths about our relationship that neither of us was ready to face. It wasn't until that Easter dinner conversation, when Charles started questioning my service record, that I realized the protection had never been mutual. I'd spent 20 years covering for his mistakes, funding his dreams, and defending his reputation. But when my credibility was on the line, when my service was being minimized and dismissed, Charles wasn't just failing to protect me. He was leading the attack. The drive home from the courthouse was silent. Patricia had offered to come with me, but I needed the solitude to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed constantly, family members trying to reach me with questions, congratulations, demands for explanation. I turned it off. The family home felt different when I walked through the front door. Larger somehow, though nothing had changed since Dad's funeral. The furniture was still arranged exactly as Mom had left it before she passed 5 years ago. Dad's reading chair still held the indent from his body, his bookmark still marking his place in a biography he'd never finish. But it was mine now. All of it. The house where we'd grown up, where Charles had broken windows and I'd covered for him, where I'd tutored him through high school math and he'd promised to pay me back someday. The irony was almost too much to bear. I made coffee and sat in Dad's chair, letting the weight of the day settle around me. The sealed dossier had changed everything, but I couldn't stop thinking about the years that had led to this moment. All those small compromises, all those times I'd chosen loyalty over truth, protection over confrontation. My phone rang just after sunset. Charles, of course. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message while staring out at the backyard where we'd built forts and played soldier and promised always to take care of each other. Vanessa, we need to talk. This whole thing is insane. I don't know what kind of stories you told that lawyer, but this isn't over. Dad would never have wanted this. He would never have wanted our family torn apart over money. Call me back. 3 more calls followed, each message more desperate than the last. In the final one, his voice cracked slightly. Look, I know things got heated in court today. But we're family, Vanessa. We've always worked things out. We can work this out too. But we couldn't work this out, and we both knew it. He crossed a line when he stood up in that courtroom and called me a fake soldier in front of our entire extended family. He'd weaponized 20 years of trust and sacrifice, turning my service into a punchline for his own purposes. I found myself walking through the house, room by room, remembering all the moments that had brought us to this point. The den where I'd helped him with his homework. The kitchen where I'd lied to Mom about the broken lamp. The basement where I'd hidden his marijuana before our parents' anniversary party. Each memory felt tainted now, recontextualized by the understanding that none of it had ever been reciprocal. The guest room had always been mine when I was home on leave. Military-issued precision in a house full of comfortable chaos. My ribbons and commendations were displayed on the dresser, the visible evidence of a career Charles had spent years diminishing. I picked up my Bronze Star, remembering the day it had been awarded, the ceremony Dad had been so proud to attend. I don't understand what she actually did to earn this, Charles had told a cousin at the reception afterward. The military gives out medals for everything these days. He'd been planting doubt even then, I realized. Preparing the ground for today's assault. How long had he been planning this? How many family conversations had he steered toward questioning my service? How many relatives had he convinced that my reputation was inflated? My laptop was still set up on the guest room desk. I opened it and pulled up my banking records, scrolling through years of transfers to Charles's account. $27,000 over 8 years. Not counting the loan I'd co-signed, the debts I'd helped him consolidate, the business ventures I'd funded without expecting return. I'd been subsidizing his lifestyle while he'd been undermining my reputation. Paying for the privilege of being dismissed and diminished by someone who owed his stability to my sacrifice. The numbers were damning, but they weren't the worst part. The worst part was remembering how grateful he'd always seemed when I'd helped him. The relief in his voice, the promises to pay me back, the assurances that this time was different, that this crisis was the last one. You're the best sister anyone could ask for, he'd tell me after each rescue. I don't know what I'd do without you. But he'd been planning for a future without me, hadn't he? A future where his credibility mattered more than mine, where his version of our story took precedence over the truth. The inheritance had just been the catalyst. The real issue was deeper than money. My phone rang again. Not Charles this time, but Aunt Linda. Vanessa, honey, what happened in court today? Charles is saying there was some kind of mistake with the will reading. No mistake. Dad's wishes were honored. But Charles said you had false documents about your service record. He's very upset. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of having to defend myself against accusations that should never have been made. Aunt Linda, my service record is accurate and documented. The court confirmed that today. Well, yes, but Charles knows you better than anyone. He's just concerned that maybe things got exaggerated over the years, and now there's all this confusion about the inheritance. There it was. The seed Charles had planted, taking root exactly as he'd intended. Even confronted with official military documentation reviewed by a federal judge, the family was still more inclined to believe Charles's version of events than accept that I might actually be who I'd always claimed to be. The court reviewed classified documentation, Aunt Linda. There's no confusion about anything. Classified? Oh, honey, I think maybe you're taking this military thing too seriously. Charles just wants what's fair for everyone. I hung up without saying goodbye. Outside, the sun had set completely, leaving the house in darkness except for the single lamp I'd turned on in Dad's study. The silence felt profound after months of funeral preparations and legal meetings and family obligations. For the first time since Dad had died, I was completely alone. No one needed anything from me. No crisis required immediate attention. No family emergency demanded my intervention. I could sit in this house that was now legally mine and simply exist without having to justify or explain or defend myself to anyone. The freedom was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I made dinner from ingredients I found in Dad's pantry, eating at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals as a family. Everything tasted different now, sharper somehow, like I'd been eating through gauze for years and could finally taste clearly again. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Media requests coming in about the courthouse incident. Recommend no comment until we discuss strategy. Media requests. Of course. Charles had turned the will reading into a public spectacle, and now we were all living with the consequences. I wondered how he'd spin this for reporters, what version of events would make him look sympathetic rather than cruel. But that wasn't my problem anymore. For the first time in my adult life, Charles's choices were his to own completely. I didn't have to clean up his messes or manage the fallout from his decisions. The only person I needed to protect was myself. I went to bed in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of who I'd been before the military, before the deployments, before I'd learned that protection could become prison if you weren't careful about the terms. Tomorrow would bring phone calls and legal paperwork and family confrontations, but tonight belonged to me. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. It sounded like freedom. Thanks for listening. If this resonated, like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs a reminder that boundaries aren't betrayal, they're survival. Quick questions for you. Have you ever had a family member publicly question your integrity? What did you do next? Would you have taken the split it quietly deal or stood firm? Where's the line between keeping peace and enabling? If someone apologized after a public attack, what would real repair look like to you? What's one boundary you wish you'd set sooner?